It's about 15 miles long and 12 miles wide. You really need an auto cue for this. I'll never remember all this in a million years. I'll just give you a potted history, just bear with me, and then it's out of the way. It was about 70,000 years ago that man left the Rift Valley in East Africa and began to migrate north over the Red Sea. One branch went east through Europe, another branch went away through Russia, across the Bering Strait into America, and then down into South America. And then another branch came off that down through Arabia, the Indian Peninsula, and down into the Polynesian Islands. But about 1,000 years ago, a group from the Polynesian Islands, probably in double rigger canoes, big things, made their way across the Pacific to this place, and they obviously had to bring everything with them. Seeds, pigs, chickens, you name it, on these big canoes, and land on this remote island. It's 2,600 miles from Chile, and about the same from Tahiti in the west. The locals call it the belly button of the world, although they have a Spanish name for it, but my Spanish is absolutely useless. And our place is well known for these statues called moai. They're all around the coast, often singly, but more often than not on platforms. And each tribe, the island was divided up. Each tribe had their own little group of moai and platforms. And nobody really knows, but it was thought that they were to honour the ancestors. In other words, if you want to make contact with your ancestors, you came to a place like this and made your prayers or whatever they were into, chanting. They all faced inland, except for one group. They were all looking inland, and they were all quarried at one place. So they had to be moved long distances, maybe 15 miles or more. And how they moved them is very much a question of conjecture. But it would seem highly unlikely that they were laid flat on the ground and pulled on rollers made from trees, which the island was covered with at that time. And they all seem to have been built or made between 1200 and 1600. And after that, no more appeared. There's more than 800 of them altogether. Part two, I'll divide this up into bits and slip it in odd places, otherwise you get bored with it all. It was first discovered by Westerners. It was discovered by 3 Dutch ships, captained by probably Willem somebody or other, I don't know, who appeared on Easter Day in 1772, and that's why its western name is Easter Island. It was still forested at that time. They had lots of crops and a seemingly happy population of between 2,000 and 3,000 according to these Dutchmen. Although there has been conjecture that prior to that the population was much larger. But of course, like all of these things, when you get a small place like this divided up into tribal regions, you get tribal warfare, and there seemed to be an awful lot of that going on. However, in 1877, there was only 111 left. Now, where on earth had they all gone to? They'd all been but wiped out. Now, the common theory is that they spent the island's resources, but particularly the extensive forest, building these moai until the island could no longer sustain a large population. It's called ecocide, but many people don't think it's quite that simple. There's a lot more to it. As I said, the island was divided into tribal regions, and there was rivalry between the tribes, often very violent rivalry, and there's evidence of that in historical records, skeletons of bodies damaged caused by violence. Now, Captain Cook, one of my local lads, born in North Yorkshire, he visited the island only 50 years after the Dutch, so that would be what? 1822. My maths is right. And there was a lot of evidence of disease. Society had begun to collapse, and many of these moai had been lowered to the ground. It would seem that the protection of the ancestors had been severely undermined. So, about 1540 was when all this began. The ancestor cult of the moai was superseded by a new cult, that of the Birdman. And you could only make contact with the dead, not through the moai or these ceremonial grounds, but through living warriors who would become very, very popular and very powerful. So the manufacture of moai and erection of moai dwindled away to nothing. In 1760 there was a competition began to be held for who was going to be the Birdman. And the people who took to take part in this competition were chosen for this in a dream. I don't know who was dreaming, or whether they appeared by name or a list or whatever. I have no clue, nobody knows. And each of these people chosen, who was obviously one of these powerful warrior types or an elder, they selected a strong young man and they became their sponsor. And these young men had to swim to an island offshore and come back with a sooty tern's egg. And the first one to do so, his sponsor became the Birdman from the air, and there were an awful lot of privileges attached to it. Anyway, such heathenism was decidedly no go for the Roman Catholic missionaries who'd arrived. They came in the 1860s and they knocked the ceremony on the head. They wouldn't have anything. It was Jesus or nothing. Take your pick. Similarly, in the 1860s, people began to appear from South America, particularly Peruvian miners. Oh, they were slave traders, really, they weren't really miners. And they came for the first time in 1860, and they carted off 1,500 men with, I suspect, a sizable number of them promised riches beyond their wildest dreams. But a fair number of them, I would imagine, were coerced into going. Coerced being probably a weak word for that. And they took them to work in the Peruvian mines. Absolutely horrendous places, a bit like coal mines in England at the same time. Only 12 of these people returned to Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, and they brought with them smallpox. Not the riches they were expected to bring. Anyway, obviously the population was just absolutely hammered. Whalers also began to appear with whaling ships, always in need of crew, and so they started press ganging, kidnapping young, strong Rapa Nui and hauling them off to crew whaling ships to the southern oceans to catch whales. And these whalers, seemingly they brought tuberculosis with them, so the Rapa Nui contact with the Western world certainly wasn't full of the promises that you'd expect. Anyway, such was the desperate strait, they began to sell off the island bit by bit to a Frenchman. He bought it all on the cheap. And I think they were probably quite happy to get rid of it and get some money, these islanders that were left. He eventually bought the whole shooting match, and the islanders were all kicked off and herded down into one little town, which is the capital of Eastern Island now, Hangaroa. They were all herded down into there. And he introduced merino sheep, this French fellow. I can't remember how many he brought to begin with, but it was several hundred he brought with him, but maybe 600, say, just for argument's sake. But eventually, there was 70,000 of the blighters all over the shop, and sheep like goats will eat anything, and they just decimated the vegetation, just absolutely creamed it off, leaving it much as you see now, desolate. Well, on a day-to-day, it's not desolate, it's absolutely wonderful. But very, very few trees, and the trees that you see around, eucalyptus from Australia and the odd plantation, but they're working to try and renovate the situation. But when you've got horses roaming all over the place, they just eat anything that, especially in the dry weather. They'll eat saplings, no bother at all. Well, the islanders, having sold this land to this Frenchman, being herded off down into a small corner of the island, decided they'd had enough, and they set about to, and they murdered this Frenchman, did away with him. We're a Scottish company. They get everywhere, these Scots. They bought the island and they continued with a sheep farm. In fact, it was like a sheep ranch. It wasn't a farm as such. It was a big ranch. And eventually, in 1888, the Chilean government took over the place and have ruled it ever since. It's been a province of Chile ever since. But I think there is an undercurrent of an independence movement. Nobody really wants to talk about it. But I think they'd be best off staying where they are with the Chileans. So the population is now 5,000, and they get about 85,000 tourists a year. Well, where they all are today, I don't know. So if they'd, just been allowed to go their merry way without contact with Europeans, and all that brought with them slave traders, missionaries, sheep farmers, would the Rapa Nui people and their culture, would they be thriving? Well, it's difficult to say, really. One thing about these islands in isolation is that it's very difficult to keep the young people here. They want all the glamour of modern life, big cities, and good jobs. And I suspect that there would be, if it was still here, I suspect it would be mainly the old who were surviving here, and the population of the island would gradually dwindle away to nothing. This happened to lots of islands. St Kilda's on the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, which is much more close to home, in the 1930s, they just could not sustain their population. Disease was just rampant, tuberculosis in particular, which had been brought to the island. And so they sent a message to the British government saying they wanted evacuating. So, is it just a coincidence that their troubles became almost terminal with the arrival of Westerners, whether via South America or from Europe? Maybe we should ask the Red Indians and Aborigines, and maybe the Maori, what they feel about it. Anyway, that's it. Let's go and have a look at this this Moai platform.